The folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. What can we say about spanking? Some of these are from personal experience, and some of them are from Dr. Dobson's book, The New Narrative of Discipline. First of all, spanking should not be done to physically abuse a child. We are not given our children so that we can abuse them. If we leave welts on a child, if we leave bruises, if we break the skin, we've gone too far. That's not what spanking is intended to do. And it should not be done to intimidate a child. We're not wanting to destroy them psychologically either. But just because there's one extreme doesn't mean we need to go the other extreme and say, well, spanking is wrong. Now, Dr. Dobson recommends spanking primarily between the ages of 2 and 6. He says in some situations you might want to do it up until they're about 12 years old. But 2 and 6, why? Because that's the age where you can't as effectively take away privileges. You can't take away other things. You can't take away privileges of playing with toys and whatever when they're that little. And so implementing a little bit of pain on the backside can go a long way in teaching children how to control their own behavior. And that's what we're after, trying to teach children to control their own behavior. Now, spanking, Dr. Dobson recommends, and I agree with him, that spanking should be used not for forgetting something. Oh, I forgot to take out the trash. My opinion is that doesn't warrant a spanking. It warrants taking away some other privilege. The spanking should be reserved for straight out disobedience, for sassiness, for overt acts of rebellion against parental authority. That's what Dr. Dobson recommends, and from personal experience, I think that is correct. For stopping temper tantrums. One of our girls has only had one temper tantrum in her life. I taught her very early that that's not going to give her anything good. And the other one has never had one. Dr. Dobson recommends that spanking should not be so infrequent or whimsical that it has no impact. One of the biggest things that we need to remember as parents is that we have to be consistent. And that's why it's hard when we've been busy all day. We come home one day and we're tired and we'll spank somebody at the drop of a hat, and the next day we're feeling good and we don't, even though our child has done the exact same thing. So we have to be careful and control ourselves to the degree that we're as consistent as possible. We also have to remember that children will be children. We're not going to get the same level of behavior out of a 5-year-old that we can get out of a 15-year-old building. And we can't expect the same. Little boys. I don't have boys. I don't know personal experience what it's like to be a parent of a child. But I have babysit boys. And I'm no more thankful than the hour when I can send them back to mom and dad. You know, boys are different. They're wired differently. Of course, I can remember how I was when I was a boy. And we have to make some allowances for that. But at the same time, being a boy doesn't give them the right to run wild. Boys can be taught to control their own behavior as well. Now, if you have not been consistent up to this point, there's no better time to start than right now. And if your child is old enough to recognize that you've been inconsistent, they say, hey, that's not the way you used to do it. You can say, that's okay, I'm learning how to be a good parent too. And you can start being consistent. Disciplining a strong-willed child is another challenge. Dr. Dobson has a book specially for strong-willed children. If you have a strong-willed child, I would encourage you to get that. I've not personally read it myself. But a strong-willed child requires a stronger-willed and smarter parent. And that, of course, requires an extra challenge on your part. Relative to all forms of punishment, here's an important point I think to keep in mind. If it doesn't hurt, it's not worth avoiding the next time. And that's why I said early on that when I spanked the girls, I intended it to be the last time I spanked them because I want them to understand. If I threat next time, you're going to remember the last time. You're going to say, okay, I don't want to go through that again. But relative to all forms of punishment, if it doesn't hurt the child in some way, then they're not going to avoid it next time. My mom did not hurt my behavior. You know what then? When your daddy gets home. Now that was enough. So we need to keep that in mind. And then we need to remember that some children do not need to be spanked. A child who has been abused, children who are older and spanking would be psychologically humiliating, or children who have mental disabilities need to be disciplined in other ways. Well, that's enough about discipline. I've got 3 more to run through, and we'll go through these a little faster. But we need to create in our home an environment conducive to our children growing up and becoming Christians. We need to have a home that's filled with encouragement. We don't need a harsh, overly critical home, but a home that builds up our children. Turn to Colossians chapter 3 real quickly. And let us see what Paul has to say about living the Christian life, and if it applies anywhere, it applies in the home. Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 12. Paul says, "So those who have been chosen by God, holy and beloved," notice what he says, "put on, mom and dad, put on a heart of compassion. Put on kindness and humility and gentleness towards your children, and patience, bearing with one another." Notice what he says, "forgiving one another. Just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you." And verse 14, "Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity." And that applies again to us as parents more than anything else. We need to recognize that our children are unique individuals. If we have more than one child, we do not need to compare the younger child to the older child. That is not conducive to anything good. We need to recognize that our younger children have their own weaknesses and their own strengths. And we need to praise their strengths, and we need to help them work through their weaknesses. Way back in 1900, there's a little boy living in Abilene, Kansas. 10 years old, and his mom and dad wouldn't let him go trick-or-treating with his older siblings. He got so mad that he went outside and started beating an apple tree with his bare fist, taking his frustration out on that tree until his flesh was raw. And he came back in and he was sent to his room. And an hour or so later, his mama came in and sat down on his bed. And she said, "Son," she said, "I know that you have a problem with your temper, more so than the other children. And you've got to get a handle on it." And she quoted to him Proverbs 16 and verse 32. That a man who does not have control over his own spirit is like a city that is without walls. And she put ointment on his hands and bandaged them up. And when President Dwight Eisenhower was 76 years old, he remembered that event where his mama helped him to grow through that weakness that he had. Every child has a weakness. And we as parents have to encourage them. Constantly create an environment in our home where we affirm our confidence in our children. The third thing that we need to have in our home is humility. You know, this is one way, the only way, in fact, where Jesus describes himself, his own character, his own personality. And that was through humility. "I am meek and lowly," Jesus said. And we as parents have to be humble. And we have to allow our children to see that humility. Well, how do we do that? Let me run through briefly how we teach our children humility in our home. First of all, we need to let them see us or hear us asking for help. They need to hear us asking God in prayer for help. They need to see us asking older, mature Christians for help. They need to see us and recognize that we understand that we don't have all the answers. Second of all, we need to admit when we're wrong and ask for forgiveness. There is nothing immature and there's nothing childish about a parent asking the child to forgive them. "I'm sorry I lost my temper. I'm sorry I said that I shouldn't have." That teaches our children to admit when they are wrong too. We need to meditate on what it means to be humble, and we need to demonstrate a dependence on God's Word. Isaiah 66 and verse 2, God through the prophet Isaiah says, "To whom shall I look? He who is humble and contrite and whose heart trembles at my word." And so our children need to see us and hear us reading from God's Word. Our children need to be in Bible class. And we need to be in Bible class too. Parents, when we send our children to Bible class, but then we don't go ourselves, what we are teaching by our example is that Bible class is for children. And when they grow up, just like the cartoons, they're going to put it away when they become an adult. They're going to say, well, Bible class is for children. And that's the wrong lesson we need to be teaching our children. So to teach them humility, we need to show them that we are relying on learning from God's Word as well. And then number 4, and finally, we need to create a home atmosphere that is full of joy. We never need to give our children any indication that we are anything but thankful that God gave them to us. They need to always grow up thinking that they are a blessing in Mom and Dad's life. And we need to let them know that we appreciate God giving them to us. They need to grow up feeling that they make our lives more enjoyable. They're not a burden. But we are so very thankful that they are with us. We need to become a part of their lives. Our children have their own interests. And we need to try to participate in those interests to the degree that we can. And then we also need to invite them into our life. I expect little Lily and little Emma to know more about cars by the time they're 15 years old than I know at 40. Ian Hammond, Shirley's grandson, loves to cook. There's nothing wrong with teaching girls how to change oil in a car. There's nothing wrong with teaching boys how to cook. That doesn't create men out of girls and doesn't create women out of boys. How many of you women would love to have a husband who can cook? Invite your children into your world and teach them what you do. Because it allows you to spend time together. And your children will grow up loving that time that they spend with you. In Galatians 6 and verse 8, the Apostle Paul teaches that whatever we sow, we're going to reap. If we sow to the flesh in our home, then we can't be surprised but our children will grow up reaping the flesh. But if we want to reap from the Spirit in our homes, then we've got to sow to the Spirit in our home. And so we need to live lives of integrity and lives of credibility. Because the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 4 and verse 16, he says, "Take heed to yourself and to your doctrine. For in doing this you will save both yourself and those who hear you." And so we need to teach our children the Bible, and we need to live it in our lives. Because the Bible teaches that gospel words plus a godly example equals Christian children. And I believe that's what we all want. The passage that we read last Sunday morning before the sermon is Psalms 127. And in Psalms 127, the last 2 verses, the psalmist says that children are like arrows in the hand of a mighty man. Blessed is the man who has his quiver full of them. The idea is that our children are in our hands like arrows, and we're sending them back to God. But in order to do that, we've got to take our responsibility as parents seriously. Our children aren't going to be in heaven by accident. And they won't be in heaven just by looking at our example. They'll be in heaven because we taught them through word and through example what they need to know and how they need to live. And so parents, moms, and dads, right now, if you do not, I want you to develop a vision in your mind of what you want your children to be when they're 30 years old. I want you to develop in your mind a vision of what kind of person I want your son or your daughter to be when they're 30 years old. And then discipline them every day with that vision in mind. Let that vision affect